So recently I did a short video on social media about indecision, or having really a lot of difficulty making decisions. It can be an extremely limiting problem for childhood trauma survivors. And many of you asked for a full video on this very tricky issue and how to work on it. So here goes. So to recap, decision making, the problem of it as childhood trauma survivors, can manifest in big and small decisions like, should you break up with somebody? Should you switch jobs? Should you take a class? Should you get back to somebody? Or even deciding on what you're going to have at the restaurant. And the smaller decisions, it's funny, but they tell just as much of a childhood trauma story as the bigger ones. So in the struggling with just making a decision, it's like a paralysis of endless debating with ourselves or avoiding deciding, like perpetually tabling something or taking way too long to make a decision. Here are some examples. Staying with a partner for way too long in this debate with yourself and putting off a breakup. Or staying in a bad job for years due to the fear of like a new process, not knowing what's going to be on the other side of a new job. And that's going to be a lot of the focus of this video. Staying in ambiguity on getting back to someone about plans. Changing your order several times and still not feeling good about it, in a similar way to like your online purchase cart. And if any of you have gotten lost on an online review about buying a product for hours only to give up, that's kind of what I mean by this stuff, big and small stuff. Hopefully we know that we're being neurotic, and the inability to make a decision isn't good for us for the following reasons. First, it erodes our self-confidence in being able to handle the outcomes of our decisions. We're spending way too much time in anxiety and unnecessary kind of suffering for most of this indecision stuff. It affects others around us, like our friends or our partners. They lose the connection with us because we're in this neurotic place, or they get frustrated about plans or a meal or endless conversations about breaking up with somebody. So most importantly, our stuck place around decisions isn't good for you because it takes away from your flow in life and your security within yourself about being able to handle anything, including a change or including a different outcome, like leaving a crap job for a better one, or taking a risk and kind of living your life in a better way. It's really not good for us. So for the rest of the video, keep thinking about what is it on the other side of making a decision that really frightens you or limits you in the way that you can't make one. So how might it come from childhood trauma? It's funny, but I had the opposite problem about making decisions, meaning where I grew up in this very chaotic alcoholic home, I kind of call it like an anything goes kind of childhood. So decisions were kind of too loose and too easy for me. For me, like jobs or eventually going back to school or dating someone or taking in like a sketchy roommate or even going to therapy, my attitude as a younger guy was just like, F it. I'll give it a whirl. I'll give anything a whirl. In many ways, that freedom to make an on-the-spot choice worked for me, and in many ways, it really kind of got me into trouble. So some of us need to reclaim letting go of what's going to be the other side of a decision, and some of us need to be more thoughtful about our decisions. There's kind of a spectrum to it. So being impulsive or careless about decisions and being obsessive about decisions are actually kind of good strategies from our childhood trauma when we were kids, because every kid comes up with their own strategy that keeps them safe. Being careless is a strategy about like not being real about how things could go wrong, and defending against consequences, defending against decisions, like a little bit of bravado, and ignoring the fear, ignoring like a healthy fear, which would keep us safe. And being obsessive or indecisive or neurotic about decisions is a strategy to control the outcomes and control those consequences about our decisions. Not deciding keeps us safe. And as a side note, when I'm using the word neurotic, it's not a judgmental tone or why I'm using that. All neuroticism means to me is just evidence of childhood suffering. Oh, and also I'm Patrick Tian. I'm a licensed clinical therapist specializing in childhood trauma and the abusive family system. If you like this video, you can hit some buttons on the screen you can't miss with any of the buttons, specifically the like button or the subscribe button or the share button. And if you're stuck in your recovery and you want to add a resource to maybe some therapy that you may be already doing, I host a monthly healing community membership. We meet twice a month for live Q&As every other Wednesday, and we go over questions about inner child work or childhood trauma with me. I also send out weekly journaling prompts to keep members kind of on task and doing some inner child work. And in addition to the monthly healing community, the membership also includes all my e-course work, all the stuff that I have available online, including old webinars and access to upcoming webinars that I do. So I'll put, if you click this ball up here, it takes you right to the healing community membership. And I'll also put video links that I mentioned in this video description as well that's related to this video, and my Patreon link and all my social media stuff. So you can all find it in the description of the video. So the problem that we have with decisions and being stuck in them or avoiding them can come from any of the following childhood trauma issues. So I'm doing these in categories. The first category is neglect, which is like growing up without any parental guidance about how things work in the world, from to say doing a science project to say talking to adults. Another issue is overwhelm due to that lack of parental help. When who out there remembers like having to figure out that school project on your own without any help, and that overwhelm of that, or say what to do about an abusive family member. Children need a lot of help, and neglected kids don't get it. Another common one around neglect is overwhelm because you're being parentified at home, like the decisions were all on you and you were making decisions for others in the family, like you were having to be this little adult. It's a lot of pressure. Another is not mattering to our parents about decisions, such as signing up for something. As adults, we can get triggered to great shame and disbelief that there would be an art class would welcome us in, or they would have a seat for us. Sometimes decision paralysis is related to how uncomfortable it is to be seen or to be welcomed or show up to something. So again, think neglect. The other category that I have is criticism and contempt. Growing up with that daily, like, why are you wearing that? Or don't you know the difference between pliers and a monkey wrench? God, like you're just like your mother, you know, like, well, you would have messed that up again, like everything else you mess up, like that kind of tone, that kind of like, you know, criticism. Or growing up in toxic comparison, like, well, your sister's doing amazing. I don't know what your problem is. You know, she's got a great guy. She's becoming an accountant. Why can't you get it together? Another is just like everything else you start, you never finish anything. There's contempt and criticism. If you've heard any of these kind of things with that contempt and critical tone, there's kind of a really sad setup going on in that. The child is criticized at home. And then when they go attempt to get something done, either in their teenage years or even later in life, and they get triggered due to that earlier criticism, it's a setup where, again, the family might say those things like, just like everything else, you F it up. Hopefully that makes sense. Another category that I have in this about why the decision-making might come from childhood trauma is the dysfunctional parent modeling. Having parents like mine who didn't budget or who weren't realistic about money, and they made really bad decisions that had long-term consequences on everyone. Having parents that were profoundly stuck themselves and never worked on it in their own sort of growth world or therapy world. Or having parents who modeled hyper rigidity around decision making, like a parent spending months researching a purchase and being wrought with anger and anxiety about pulling the trigger on something like a lawnmower. And related to that, having a parent who lived in the world, who felt like the world was kind of out to get them in some way. And any false step had big consequences to them, real or imagined, you know. Having parents that were impulsive or careless about decisions, and weren't in tune with how their decisions affected themselves or their family or their kids, such as bringing an abusive step-parent after a divorce. Or having just extremely negative parents, like what's the point of changing jobs when we never get ahead anyway, you know? So now let's look at how the factors from childhood trauma can lead to a childhood trauma survivor avoiding decisions because of it's like their inner child is stuck back in childhood, and their inner adult needs a lot of help to kind of wake up and try to get themselves out of it. So that's where like therapy comes in. Let's maybe do a hypothetical case example. Just a very common presentation of a childhood trauma survivor who might come into my practice. Try to identify with the issues going on underneath, not the specifics about what's going on with the person. No two people have the same history nor the same problems in their adulthood. Let's just say our hypothetical client is Jill. And Jill is 30, and she's worked as a certified public accountant for 6 years, and she hates it. She is wanting to do work that is more in line with her interests, such as a master's in counseling. Like, funny how I threw that in there. Or something like wanting to start her own business in a creative art or sell stuff online. Stuff that's more in tune with like who she is. And for 3 or 4 years, she's in this pattern. She's applied to the counseling school. She's taken business courses. She's figured out all the social media stuff and does great with showing her creative stuff online. She's looked both into a rental space for her creativity, like an art space, and completed all the necessary testing for getting into a master's program. And always in the 11th hour, when it comes time for Jill to write a check on the rental space or submit her application for the master's counseling program, Jill gets overwhelmed and shuts it all down, feeling highly anxious and terrible about herself. That's more common than you actually might think. Then she might kind of find comfort, or perhaps worse, kind of numbness in the boring accounting work, and kind of forces herself to embrace it in her mind. Like, well, it's a steady benefits and long hours, and there's always work stability, especially around April. Who did I think I was for trying to do the stuff that I really wanted to do? Kind of like self-flogging. 6 months later, as the accounting again wears her down, she tries again with the same results. She gets overwhelmed and shuts the whole thing down. So there's this pattern. Let's say Jill books a therapy session with me in my practice, knowing something is up from her childhood trauma about this pattern. And this is not a commercial for my therapy practice. I'm not accepting new clients. It's just a hypothetical spelling out of a process about doing childhood trauma work and therapy with a therapist that gets it. So in session, we would do something called the genogram, which is a family tree of dysfunction, looking for the dysfunction in the family system, looking at the modeling. We would look at the family dynamics, and we would look at sort of using a tool called the family rules, and I would work with Jill on doing some education on what a healthy family system does to get their kids thriving. And we're doing all that to kind of get started on tracing the problem back to childhood and kind of nailing it. And Jill shares about her parents with me, and her father was, say, very ragey, very violent, hated his work, hated himself, and gave off the belief that doing what you love in life is selfish, and you have to be selfless and suffer in a job because of his own trauma beliefs or whatever. And it's also supported by a religion that the parents are wrapped up in. The father made himself like a violent martyr, and the mother supported all that sacrifices and codependency and didn't protect their kids from all that energy and all that rigidity and all that, like kind of hardcore belief system. And the main message about that Jill got about work is you should be lucky to grovel for whatever work that life gives you, but you do get to abuse others for your sacrifice as a provider. Jill didn't do that. So Jill's parents were also extremely cheap and rigid, and which is really like being highly risk averse. Yet there wasn't like poverty going on. Like they were, let's just say they were like a middle class. They weren't growing up in poverty, but there was just such like hypervigilance that things can go drastically wrong. And kind of a side note, probably this is important, is, Jill talking about her parents, probably the best psych quote that I know of, that I've heard of, comes from Carl Jung, who said that the most depressing thing that can affect a person's life is the unfulfilled life of their parents. That the father's martyrish, burdeny vibes will greatly affect any child, because any child just wants their parents to be happy so they can therefore be a more happy and kind of functioning family. Jill grew up in misery. And as little kids, we just want our parents to be happy so they can be more engaged and be happy with us, So Jill and I do some inner child work using a tool called dialoguing. And Jill's inner child, when asked, believes that if they get the art studio or they go back to school, go to the master's, that others will suffer. And in this case, Jill's inner child believes that she will abandon her accounting clients and her coworkers and is selfish for doing what she wants. This is a tool that we're trying to make the unconscious conscious, what's really going on there. So remember when I said earlier about thinking on what's on the other side of a decision, what's the fear around a new job or a breakup or ordering something. Inner children will project onto our jobs or to our coworkers, even if we're not really that close to them. And if Jill, say, had a partner, that projection would also go on that partner. Like the partner is going to be super judgmental and criticize her for leaving when the partner's just like, I think you should, I think you should leave. So that narrative that came from her parents was so strong that if you're going to do something for yourself, that others will suffer greatly. That's her unconscious that's driving this stuff. So also, the parental abuse around rigidity, around money, was also tricky. And say Jill is really frugal and can afford the risk of starting a business, but the inner child has huge beliefs that they inherited growing up about spending money, and the whole world's going to end if you spend money on something. So Jill and I reframe her childhood trauma that, reframing is really like rewriting what the parental message was. And the thing that we're reframing is that the father's sacrifice was really just a license for him to get attention, to be a victim, and gave himself a license to be abusive to his family. This is what it means when I say in my videos to hold a toxic parent accountable in therapy, is really spell it out what was really going on there. Healthy parents don't make their children indebted for welcoming them into their home, into their life. Healthy parents also don't weaponize their miserable choices, such as the father weaponizing his choice of employment as look what I have to do for you kind of stuff. Also, most importantly, healthy parents want their children to be fulfilled and happy and true to themselves. So what I would be teaching Jill is for her to be reparenting her inner child. And part of that parenting is to be consistently helping that inner child see that they're not bad for making decisions for themselves, reframing things. That's what inner child work is over time. Hopefully we're not doing that forever, but for a good chunk of time, we need to rewire what we experience. So, and I probably reframe it that she might actually inspire the coworkers that she mentions in sessions who also hate being an accountant. She might really inspire them as opposed to them feeling abandoned by her. So in this hypothetical, I'm giving a nice, summarized, neat portrayal of therapy, and I'm oversimplifying. Jill will probably need a really good childhood trauma group and a good amount of time in therapy to heal many things, like the decision. It's not just one thing. I mean, people come into therapy with focusing on one problem, but it means other things. Since the conditioning is so deep, it's not just an easy, quick shift out of that stuff. And the general childhood trauma beliefs that causes Jill to become overwhelmed and shut down the master's application or the rental art spaces, these are core beliefs. I'm bad, doing things for yourself is selfish, I don't deserve good things, what I do greatly affects others, and I'm not allowed to hate what doesn't work for me. So now let's take those core beliefs and we're going to categorize them into sort of 3 categories: shame, control, and security. These are the things that are greatly going to affect our decision making. So shame, top tier thing. If you're confused about your triggers, it's most likely going to be around shame. It's such a tricky thing from childhood trauma, and like 90% of childhood trauma survivors, Jill was trying to not be like her father by not acting like a martyr. But she was emulating that she had to be selfless, which is something that she kind of had to absorb from her father. And that if you're not selfless, others will suffer. It's like toxic parental shame is kind of a contagious thing. So that's the shame part in this. I'm bad. The next category is control. Inner children have immature beliefs, and it's important to develop our inner adult, a strong inner adult over time that can help that child and catch those beliefs and kind of know that they're, make the unconscious conscious. For example, when Jill tries to embrace the counting job after being overwhelmed and shutting down her dream, inner children have magical thinking about that it's going to work from now on, and believe that the crappy job shouldn't matter anymore, and they're just not going to feel that anymore. That's a decision we often kind of do, which isn't good, and it actually really never works. And what's the control in that? The control is repressing the feeling of not liking accounting or hating it. And this can often really manifest in our dating life when you're not happy with someone and the inner child says, being happy doesn't matter. I'm just going to force myself to like this person. That's what I mean about that immature, magical thinking. Controlling the risk of, say, spending money or on the art rental space, or controlling the ambiguity or risk by shutting the whole thing down. That's the control. The control is also a great strategy from childhood to put ourselves away and make ourselves small and deny our needs, which is another component to decision-making problem. And then this third category, security. The more I work as a therapist in doing what I do, the more I see that we're all ruled by a lack of security as childhood trauma survivors. And we should be getting that in a healthy family system during development. Jill didn't grow up in security in general, but especially around developing a healthy sense of self. My mentor has this beautiful phrase that every child needs a safe home base. Playing loudly made dad violent, and mom would either advise to never do that again or scold Jill about that kind of stuff. So from toddlerhood to adulthood, what kept her secure was not making others upset with her, showing up for them constantly and not upsetting anyone. So the other side of taking a risk is insecurity. You know, what's going to happen if she depletes her savings or in a master's program? What's going to happen if her art doesn't sell or the economy crashes? What's going to happen if we go through a breakup with so-and-so and then we were wrong the whole time about it and we're lonely? What happens if you order the fish at the wedding, but the chicken was actually amazing, you know, and you ordered the wrong thing? The shame and control that I mentioned earlier fuel the insecurity. True security, which I think is kind of a goal in good psychotherapy, is the ability to be okay no matter what comes up in our lives through good times and bad times. And true security also means to be able to roll with decisions instead of seeing life as just like one false move and that's finite, that's forever. As childhood trauma survivors, we're kind of conditioned ourselves to avoid pain and suffering, which was a great move, but now we're hypervigilant about not, again, being kind of in this screwed place. So that's why we don't maybe go for the new job, because it's just we never want to go back to that place where we're really up the creek. So chicken or fish could lead to suffering, and you only get one shot at chicken or fish. Is kind of like what the inner child believes. Being wrong about someone that we're dating and breaking up could leave us again getting everything wrong and being abandoned because we were wrong. Choosing to rent the art space or getting a master's and leave the accounting job is to be in a risky no man's land where the wheels are now off the bus, and that's too scary. From a survival standpoint, indecision can be looked at as simply as the fight or the freeze response, because it's really kind of a shutting down and overly thinking, and it's like an inaction kind of response coming back to what we experience in the households that we grew up in. Flight as an escape is fleeing the decision, like Jill did to return to accounting, and fleeing the anxiety created by the lack of security on what would be on the other side of that decision. And the freeze is simply shutting down as a good strategy, and maybe it'll go away. That's like the perpetually tabling something, and as a way to play it safe. So here is how to do some work around this problem around decisions. Up front, the best thing to do about the decision-making problem is to start sessions with a good childhood trauma therapist. Those are hard to get, they're hard to afford, they're hard to find. I get all that, but I feel like it's my ethical duty to say, like, that's where we should all start. If you can't get all that, I totally understand. Here is somewhat of some writing prompts, some things to explore on your own to work on it a little bit. And the first one is to figure out what is your typical decision-making process. Even if you don't make a decision, that's still a process. Meaning, is it like Jill's, where she had that cycle of wishing and researching, wanting to make it happen, only to get overwhelmed and go back to where she started? Or do you put yourself through this anxious, guilt-ridden ringer of big emotions, and then when you actually do make the decision, it wasn't that bad? Write down times that happened. Or do you eventually make decisions out of reactive fear, and it's not good for you. Come up with experiences where that happened. We have these built-in forgetters, and we don't catch these patterns, like not breaking up with an unavailable person out of fear, and we dig ourselves deeper into unhappiness. That's the first one. The second one is just to write down what's the fear. Figure out the thing that you're having an issue with deciding on, and write out and walk yourself through the thing that you're afraid of, like the doomsday scenario, the consequences of what you're afraid of, and really write that out and examine it. Like Jill had this narrative that she'd be a terrible person if she lived her life to the fullest, and she'd be selfish and she'd abandon people and she would just become this awful human being. Wasn't true. So the next one is, how might the fear that the doomsday stuff that you just outlined in number 2, how might that come from your childhood trauma story? Neglect, criticism, poor parental modeling? Could it come from like a family tragedy where your father opened up a business with someone who was shady and that ruined the family financially? That kind of stuff. So related to that third one, and to share a little bit, decisions to better myself, like go to college, they were kind of tainted by my mother's mopey attitude. She had this morose belief that things never worked out for us. So taking a risk to my inner child felt like there was this huge, scary, futile experience, because in my family, things never worked out for us. I had to reframe that as parental alcoholism and moroseness, not reality. That things weren't going to work out in the long run, like success was for other people. That's just one way decisions were hard. But my point is, we all have to dig a little bit and figure this stuff out and where it comes from. So the fourth journal prompt is regarding security. What would you need to feel more emotionally secure about the decision? In therapy, Jill needed to reframe that it's okay to make decisions to better her life, and she actually needed her parents to model that. Try not to think of something physical, like tangible, like money. Money is really nice and it's going to help you make a decision, but what would make you more secure as a person in order to be able to handle the risk emotionally? If it's about, say, leaving a bad partner, often inner children are terrified to be alone or not have a partner like your peers do. So the emotional security that is needed for the inner adult to take on a different discomfort, such as being single on purpose, as opposed to the bigger discomfort of being in a relationship that is really like quiet desperation and doesn't work. It's not what we want, but the inner child would need that inner adult to take care of them and to be more invested in the inner child, so they would be able to tolerate that other discomfort, the other side of a decision. Same with the new job. The inner adult would need to provide emotional security and comfort and care in order for both of them to be able to tolerate whether the new job is going to work out or not. Lastly, here are some more emotional security ideas to kind of get your brain kind of like thinking about this stuff. Is, my favorite thing is, you always have the right to change your mind. Decisions are often about trading discomfort for a new experience, which is also going to be uncomfortable, like trading discomforts, but being stuck, in my mind, is kind of the worst discomfort, because it's really, we go to a hopeless place when we get that stuck. And I learned this, another piece, I actually learned this from a Marine. You can make a decision, and then when things get complicated, you can modify your decision. Inner children really get caught up in this black and white place and perfect from now kind of stuff. And I think that Marine strategy is just like, don't get bogged down in paralysis when you're in the middle of a firefight, like that kind of a thing. And lastly is that you're an adult now and you can handle the other side of the decisions, but that wasn't true growing up, and your body is conditioned to be terrified around decisions and not having security or any help around them. A new job is going to come with new stress. An online purchase might not work out for what you want, and it might be a pain in the ass that you have to return it. A breakup will come with pain and loneliness, and the chicken might be awful and the fish could have been amazing. And why I say all that is the usual culprit to the decision-making problem for childhood trauma survivors is the inner child usually thinks they can research and they want to know exactly what making a decision is going to look like on the other side, but we can't know that. That's where security comes in. That's why we need the security to be able to handle anything. So we won't leave the relationship because we don't know exactly how it's all going to go. You know, the inner adult really needs to step in and tolerate what's on the other side of decisions, which usually comes with more flow and joy in our lives eventually. So I'd love to hear if this was helpful to you, like what your personal stuck place is. And I'd really love to hear about those of you who put off something and then maybe you took the risk, made a decision. It might have been hard, but your life got better. I would love to hear about that stuff too. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.